World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service. This is Sean Lay with The Real Story. One topic, 1 hour every week. And this week, on Monday, Iowans will traipse through the snow to their local community hall where they'll argue and debate with neighbours before declaring whom they want to be president. These are the first votes cast in a process that stretches out for 11 months until polling day, the 5th of November. And if it's as close as it looks now, it may not end there. Joe Biden and Donald Trump expect they'll be on the ballot paper. What happens if one of them falls ill or even dies? And could an independent or third-party candidate help decide the result? Democrats will fire up their base against individual states, further limiting abortion. The Republicans against migrants crossing the US border. But what do Americans whose votes will count the most want to hear? The mechanics and what matters in this US presidential election. That's The Real Story from the BBC coming up after the news.
Hello, I'm Moira Alderson with the BBC News. The US and Britain have mounted overnight military strikes from the air and sea against more than 60 Houthi military targets in Yemen. The action is in response to ongoing attacks on ships in the Red Sea by the rebel movement. Sebastian Usher reports.
Explosions were reported throughout Yemen, with US Central Command saying that Houthi command centres, munition depots and air defence systems were hit. The British Armed Forces Minister James Heappey has said the strikes were in self-defence of warships protecting commercial shipping from Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. He said that no further action was planned for now. The Houthi military spokesman has said that 5 of the movement's fighters were killed and 6 others wounded. He said the attacks would not go without punishment or retaliation, and declared that the group would continue to target ships heading for Israel.
The Houthis have vowed to continue support for Palestinians in Gaza and carry on attacks on ships in the Red Sea. The Saudi Foreign Ministry asked Washington and its allies to avoid escalation. From Washington, here's our North America editor, Sarah Smith.
The US administration has been talking tough for days about this, warning that there would be consequences, as they call it, if the Houthis didn't stop their attacks on ships in the Red Sea. And we heard that again from the White House today, saying these attacks have to stop or the Houthis will bear the consequences. Right now, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is on his way back from a really extensive trip around the Middle East. And one of his key objectives there was to try and stop the Israel-Gaza war from escalating. Right from the beginning, the US has been most worried about this conflict spreading and drawing in other countries.
Israel has begun its response at the United Nations highest court to South Africa's allegations that it's committing genocide in the Gaza Strip. It's the second and final day of hearings at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. The British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is on a rare visit to Ukraine to meet Volodymyr Zelensky. His visit coincides with an announcement that Britain will give Ukraine more than $3 billion in military support for the next financial year. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
For months, MPs have been pushing the government to say how much military support it would give Ukraine in the next financial year. Rishi Sunak said it would amount to £2.5 billion. The focus will be on long-range missiles, air defence and artillery. The financial commitment comes as both the United States and the European Union are struggling to agree their own packages of support, with Ukraine in desperate need of more shells and missiles. Crucially, the government has chosen not to make a financial commitment lasting several years. Instead, the Prime Minister will sign a new agreement formalising the UK's security commitment to Ukraine.
James Landale reporting. World News from the BBC. Witnesses say airstrikes and shelling in the Sudanese capital Khartoum killed more than 30 civilians on Thursday. An activist said some of the victims died when an artillery shell hit a house where people had gathered for a social event. He described the situation as catastrophic. The local market was also reportedly hit. China's foreign ministry says it's mediated peace talks between Myanmar's ruling military and armed rebel groups known as the Three Brotherhood Alliance. Beijing says both sides agreed to halt fighting and resolve disputes through dialogue. A temporary ceasefire was confirmed by one of the group's leaders. There's been no response from the military government. Mass rallies are taking place in Taiwan on the eve of a pivotal general election. Nearly 20 million people will vote on Saturday for a new president and members of parliament. The three-way presidential race is being closely watched by its increasingly assertive neighbour, China, which considers Taiwan part of its own territory. Scientists in Britain have discovered a ring-shaped cosmic megastructure, which they say challenges our understanding of the universe. Seen from Earth, the Big Ring, as it's been called, is 15 times the size of the Moon. Caleb Ghosh explains.
The researchers have unsurprisingly named the structure the Big Ring, but that's somewhat of an understatement. It's 7.8 trillion billion miles in diameter. It's made up of galaxies and galaxy clusters. What's also remarkable is that such large structures should not exist, according to one of the guiding ideas of astronomy called the cosmological principle. It states that all matter is spread smoothly across the universe. Although stars, planets and galaxies are huge clumps of matter in our eyes, in the context of the size of the universe, they're insignificant, and the theory is that much bigger patches of matter should not form.
That's the latest. BBC News.
This is The Real Story from the BBC. I'm Sean Lay with your weekly deep dive into a story that's making news and changing lives. On Monday, the race for the White House begins in earnest as voters in the Midwestern state of Iowa decide which politician they want to be on the ballot.
We want your vote on January 15th. We're asking you to caucus for us.
We can't have a country in disarray and a world on fire and go through 4 more years of chaos. We won't survive it.
And Ron DeSanctimonious and Nikki Haley and all the rest of the pack will never do what it takes to secure the border. They'll never do what it takes to make our country great again. They're never going to do it. I know them. I know them all very well.
The Iowa caucus is just the first in months of voting across America's 50 states as Republicans determine who will represent their party in the presidential election on the 5th of November. Former President Donald Trump is favourite. The Democrats too are holding primaries, but with the sitting president intending to run for re-election, barring unforeseen events, Joe Biden will likely be their standard bearer once again. He says the stakes this year couldn't be higher.
Whether democracy is still America's sacred cause is the most urgent question of our time. That's what the 2024 election is all about.
But it's the voters who decide what an election is really about. The economy, perhaps, or undocumented migrants crossing into the US from Mexico and beyond. Which candidate will be most successful at energising and turning out their supporters? And it'll be the undecided or swing voters in a small number of key states who'll help determine who wins. Just half a dozen of the 50 states will be where most of the campaigning will happen. This is a race with global impact. Will the next president back Ukraine in the way Mr. Biden has done? Will trade barriers with the outside world rise or fall? Coming up in this edition of The Real Story, how will this election campaign unfold? And what could it mean for Americans, their neighbours, and for the world beyond? Well, last week we explored the state of democracy across the globe at the start of a year in which more people have the right to vote than ever before. It's not a rosy picture. You can find that programme online or in our podcast feed. This week we're building on that discussion by taking a look at how the year may unfold in the world's most closely observed democracy, the United States. To make sense of it, our Real Story panel. Julia Azari is a professor of political science at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, one of those all-important swing states we're going to be talking about. Welcome to the programme. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of this election year, Julia, have you an anecdote which may help us understand what makes elections in the United States distinct?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to start by sharing a little story from the 2016 election here in Wisconsin. I was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Milwaukee doing a little writing, editing, and what have you, and someone across from me in the coffee shop said, "I think a politician just walked in. I can't place him." And I turned around expecting to see our state senator or something, and it was Bernie Sanders. And I have truly never seen anything like this coffee shop. So we're in downtown Milwaukee near several of the universities, and there are a lot of young people in their 20s there, and he was mobbed. He was like a rock star. He couldn't sit down. Someone brought in their dog and said, "I've named my dog after you, and I want you to meet him." I think this, kind of shows life in a swing state. You meet a lot of candidates. It was pretty fun to see.
Thank you very much. Julia Manchester is a reporter for The Hill, a news organisation based in Washington, D.C., focused on all the twists and turns of US politics. She joins me from Iowa, where she's visiting to cover Monday's caucus. Julia Manchester, welcome. Have you a story which illuminates the quirks of American elections?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I thought it was interesting listening to Julia's story about more so retail politics, in-person politicking, which is so important in states like Iowa and New Hampshire. But this election cycle, we have seen some experimenting with more, I guess you could call it digital campaigning. And what I'm referring to is Governor DeSantis's campaign launch last May, which was unlike anything we had ever really seen in politics. In 2008, that was really the first Twitter election, with Barack Obama seizing upon Twitter, using it as a campaign resource. But Ron DeSantis decided to literally launch his campaign on Twitter, which is now known as X, in a conversation with Elon Musk. But the launch was kind of emblematic of where his campaign has ended up. It was a very bumpy launch. It was riddled with technical difficulties. You could hear Elon Musk on the hot mic, and I've heard some describe it as the beginning of the end for his campaign, even though he's still in the race and is giving no indication he's dropping out. But it sort of shows the experimentation we're seeing with a lot of campaigns in terms of what works, what doesn't. That clearly didn't work for Ron DeSantis.
We'll talk about Ron DeSantis, Governor DeSantis, who's one of the, as you say, Republican hopefuls, in a minute when we go on to talk about candidates. Thanks very much, Julia. John Prideaux is US editor for The Economist. He's also in Des Moines in Iowa. John, welcome to the program. What makes US elections special to you?
Hi, Sean. Yes, Des Moines is stuffed with journalists at the moment. So Julia, Em and I are both in Iowa at the moment, and Iowa and its caucuses are American democracy in a sense that it's most cute. You have these hyper-local events, the caucuses, on Monday, where 1,700 precincts across 99, I think, counties in Iowa will hold their own meetings, and people will try and persuade other caucus goers to vote for the candidate they favor. And it's beginning of the presidential election of 2024. It's also a big contrast between this hyper-local, small room democracy and the enormous stakes for America and for the world that this election is about. I was last night at a Trump event in Des Moines, and a couple of things struck me about that. I was talking to a Trump voter called Merle, and Merle had been to about 50 Trump events across Iowa since Donald Trump came into American politics in 2015. And it was a reminder that for a lot of Trump supporters, politics is sort of entertainment for them. They follow Trump around in the way that other people might follow a sports team. And another thing that struck me, which was that this was a guy who ran a wealth management business. I think one of the underappreciated elements of Donald Trump's support in America is quite how many college-educated and relatively affluent Americans support him. There are lots of news stories, and there have been ever since 2016, when he won the presidential election, about how Trump was the representative of sort of forgotten or left behind Americans. I think people underrate quite how strong his support is among upscale Americans. And that got me thinking about one last thing, which is just we tend to have this view of politics whereby if things are basically going well in the country, then the incumbent does well and can expect to be re-elected. And I think things are going really well in America at the moment. The economy is really strong, inflation's coming down, crime's coming down. On many, many important measures, this ought to be a fantastic environment for the incumbent, Joe Biden, but it's really not. And that tells you something about how politics in America, I think, is less these days about objective measures of how the country's doing and more about questions of identity.
Yeah, and we will talk about all of that as the programme progresses. For now, thank you very much, John. Before we explore the candidates in any detail and who's most likely to end up on the ballot on November the 5th, we need to perhaps nail down the process at this stage. John explained very eloquently, I think, the caucuses. Julia Manchester, they're an unusual part of this year, aren't they? We tend to talk more about the primary season. Can you just explain that in simple terms for people who have no idea about American politics? Because after all, these aren't votes that will determine the outcome of the election in November, but they are votes that matter, aren't they?
Right. They are votes that matter. And, obviously all of these early state contests, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, in some years more than others, Nevada, these early states give these candidates momentum going into what we call Super Tuesday. And that's when a number of other states all go to vote for their primary, or Republicans or Democrats from that state go to vote in their primary. And then you get a
So when we say,
picture.
just to clear, sorry to interrupt, when we say primary, we mean it's a kind of party primary.
A party primary,
Gotcha.
yes. Just to use this as an example, it's obviously going to be a different case this cycle, but going back to 2020, you saw Iowa and New Hampshire not being very good predictors as to who would win the Democratic nomination. In fact, President Biden left New Hampshire before the primary night officially started and went straight to South Carolina. After South Carolina and Super Tuesday, you saw him emerge as the likely Democratic nominee. This nomination process on the Republican side is very different this year because you have an incumbent president who, according to the polls that we have seen, is very, very popular and holds an unprecedented lead in many cases, including here in Iowa.
You mean a former president?
A former president, yes, but he is seen as sort of the incumbent on the Republican
The Republican
side.
incumbent, I understand.
Yes, even though he's not, you're right, he's not officially the incumbent. And getting into the caucus process, because I think this is confusing for Americans who don't live in a caucus state. A caucus is different from a primary. So in the Iowa caucuses, you will see voters go out to their caucus precincts on Monday night and sit down. It will be called to order, and there'll be some politicking that happens, speeches that happen, and they will sort of write down who their first preferences for the Republican presidential nomination, and then those results will be reported. That's different from the New Hampshire primary, which resembles the election that many of us in the U.S. and the UK are more familiar with, where you go into a ballot booth or a ballot box, you fill out your ballot, put it in, much more private. So the terminology gets confusing not only for people outside of the U.S., but for Americans as well.
Yeah, my kind of memory is you get cookies at a caucus, you don't necessarily get cookies at a primary, but
No.
maybe I was just lucky. Let's talk a bit about why this all adds up. The process helps candidates acquire delegates for the party nominating conventions held in the summer. The Democrats in Chicago, the Republicans, Julia Azari, in your city of Milwaukee. Can you give us a summary of how that works?
Yeah, so ultimately what happens is that the results of these primaries and caucuses, they're to allocate pledged delegates to go to the convention and vote for a candidate on the floor of that convention. So what we are watching as we are watching the primaries is not just, oh, Trump won in New Hampshire or Haley won in South Carolina or whatever, but how many delegates each candidate accrues. And the other piece of that is that Republicans have, in the relatively recent past, changed their delegate allocation in a way that makes it easier for somebody like Trump, who is able to consistently command a kind of plurality in the party, to win delegates. So they've made a lot more winner-take-all contests, whereas the Democrats, if they were having a more competitive nomination contest, have a more proportionate way of allocating delegates.
And Julia Azari, can you say one other thing for us? There are other elections taking place on the 5th of November, and they could also matter, couldn't they?
Yeah, so on November 5th, any number of elections will be taking place. Again, will vary a bit by state. So there are some governors that will be elected, and state legislative elections, local elections, and then every seat in the House of Representatives is up every 2 years, and about a third of the Senate will be up for re-election.
Yeah, and of course those election results could determine how effective whoever wins the presidential contest would be, because in divided government, they have to get stuff through Congress. That's what the US Constitution is all about. John Prideaux, let's talk about candidates. How certain can we be that come the 5th of November, the two names on the ballot paper, the two main names, will be Donald Trump and Joe Biden?
I'm going to stick my neck out and say I'm reasonably certain that that's the case, with a but. If this primary process for deciding who will be the Republican nominee, if it were just a case that everybody in the Republican Party, all registered Republicans, showed up and voted on the same day in a secret ballot, I think you can tell from the polls Donald Trump is so far ahead. I think this is 99% certainty that he would be the nominee. Iowa and New Hampshire throw a little bit of chaos in there, and the opportunity for candidates who are doing less well in the polls, or perhaps less well recognized, to upset that apparent inevitability of a Trump victory. And that's why Ron DeSantis has been in every county in Iowa. That's why Nikki Haley has spent so much time here. If they are able to run Donald Trump a close second in Iowa or even beat him, then if one of them is able to beat Trump in New Hampshire, and then maybe even in South Carolina, which is the third state in this process, then suddenly Donald Trump's inevitable march to the nomination starts to look a bit wobbly and things can change. And that's why it's a terrible overused cliche of political punditry, Sean, but that's why people talk about momentum in primary. I hope to get through all of this without mentioning that word, but there it is. All of that said, I think Donald Trump has got this thing basically sewn up on the Republican side.
Let's be clear who these people are, because we're bandying names around, well, understandably. Nikki Haley, former governor of the state of South Carolina and served in Donald Trump's team as ambassador to the United Nations. Ron DeSantis, current governor of Florida, and also somebody who has been very kind of pro-Trump as well in his rhetoric.
Correct, Sean. I mean, the reality is there's no anti-Trump lane in the Republican primary these days. We've just seen Chris Christie, who was really the only candidate who was happy to take Donald Trump on, square on and say, this guy's broken the law, he should go to jail, he should not be our next president. He's dropped out now because there was so little support for him. And so the candidates who are immediately behind Donald Trump in the primary, and just to underline this, they're quite a distance behind in the polling, are, as you say, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, both of whom, to some extent, are creatures of Donald Trump. Trump elevated Ron DeSantis by endorsing him when he ran for Florida governor. Prior to that, he wasn't hugely well known nationally. And so Donald Trump talks a lot about DeSantis' disloyalty in standing against him. And Nikki Haley, as you said, governor of South Carolina, so had her own political career, political platform, but I think achieved a lot more prominence as the US's ambassador to the United Nations, which was a Donald Trump appointment. So neither of them really are able to distance themselves from Trump because they've both worked quite closely with him, very closely in Haley's case, and in DeSantis' case, he sort of owes his political career to Trump. And also because there's just not a lot of demand among Republican primary voters for an anti-Trump candidate.
Julia Manchester, can I just pick up on what's happening on the Democrat side? There was a Real Clear Politics polling average published just before Christmas, which showed Mr. Trump ahead by 2.3 percentage points over Joe Biden, the incumbent president, who's a Democrat. This puts him in a stronger position than he was in 2016 in an election which he went on to win. Why isn't there a contest over who should be the Democrat candidate? Because those figures would suggest that Joe Biden is in trouble.
They absolutely do. And just to add on to that, the Hills Decision Desk HQ average of polls shows Trump up over Biden by 1 point. So it's narrowing, and we're going to see these polls fluctuating. But it does beg the question of why there isn't more of a race. There are other Democrats or other figures running for president in the Democratic primary. You have Congressman Dean Phillips from Minnesota, who is running in New Hampshire. This is seen as a long shot bid. However, it does show that there are figures in the party who are unhappy with President Biden's leadership right now and sort of think that the party needs to change course and get a fresher face in. Then you have other progressive figures running for president, including Cornel West, not running in the Democratic primary per se, but he could certainly pull progressive votes from Biden if he were to run independently. That's really important. And when I say progressive, the left-wing flank of the Democratic Party, that's very important because we're seeing Biden really struggle with progressives right now. It's rare that we see a foreign policy issue like the Israel-Hamas war really infiltrate domestic U.S. elections. However, I think this conflict could have a major impact on one of the biggest swing states in the country, Michigan, which has a very large Arab American population. We are seeing a lot of progressive candidates up and down the ballot working to appeal to that population and also appeal to young voters who are unhappy with President Biden's handling of the war in the Middle East. but they're not the only ones that pose a threat to President Biden. I think the real wild card here could be Robert F. Jr. He is, of course, the son of the late Robert F. Kennedy, and he's very well known. His family
Robert F. Kennedy, a former Attorney General in his brother's government administration back in the early 60s, who looked like he was going to become the candidate in 68 after the sitting president withdrew, but then got assassinated.
Yes, was assassinated right before could have gotten into a race. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is interesting because he was running in the Democratic primary. But, he would argue, and his supporters would argue, that he was pushed out by the Democratic Party apparatus, particularly by President Biden and the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. But now he's running as an independent. But when you look at his support, he's not only pulling support from some Democrats, but he's also pulling support from Republicans as well. He's a real wild card, so he could end up negatively impacting former President Trump as well.
I wanted to ask Julia Azari the question that has to be asked. It could happen to any presidential candidate. When you've got a president who is over 80 and a main rival who is in his late 70s, what happens if one of them dies?
So it depends on whether they would pass away before or after the convention. Before the convention is relatively straightforward. The delegates would choose someone else. After the convention, there actually are provisions within the parties to do this. The question is whether there's sort of legitimacy to do this. If someone passes away really close to election day, say after ballots have been printed, that's a little bit more challenging. But again, we actually do have provisions wherein the successful vice presidential candidate would win. So technically, this is sort of dealt with in American politics. I think the trick is, why are these two very old people the sort of seemingly inevitable nominees? That, I think, is the challenge, and it opens up these larger cans of worms within the two parties about what's going on in each of those party coalitions. I mean, I think this is sort of why you see Biden in the position that he's in, is because even though he's not very popular, and even though he has these kind of predictable problems with progressives in the party, the situation in the Democratic coalition has not changed that much since 2019 when Biden was nominated, which is that he's a kind of clear coordination point for the party. And otherwise, there's a kind of intractable fight between all of these other candidates and all of these other perspectives in the party, including, I think, the lessons of 2008, which were that this is a changed country that can elect an African American and can elect a much more diverse range of candidates, and the lessons of 2016, which is that this is a country of backlash, and where maybe a candidate that comes from a different demographic background is a liability. And so I think both of those lessons are contained within the Democratic coalition. Biden provides a good coordination point because he's very popular with African Americans, and also because he's got really high name recognition. Basically, people keep asking kind of, why is Biden the candidate again? And the answer is the party hasn't resolved the problems that it had in 2019.
So in other words, to pick up on what John Prideaux was saying, this is almost a slam dunk as a result of all of that. That's it for the first half of this programme. We've got to pause our coverage at this point because we have to take a short break. But when we return, our Real Story panel, Julia Azari, Professor of Political Science at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Julia Manchester, a reporter for The Hill, and John Prideaux, the US editor of The Economist magazine, will be discussing more of what's happening in this contest. We'll move on to look at the issues which could be on voters' minds when they go to the polls in November. That's coming up after the news, when The Real Story continues.
This is the BBC World Service, and Dr. Ashley Milton is meeting African Americans choosing to return to the country of their heritage, Ghana.
I moved from the U.S. to Ghana 6 years ago. In this documentary, I'm going to shine a light on the experiences of those of us who have made this move, whilst exploring the significant historical connection between two countries that are very close to my heart.
When I visited Cape Coast Slave Dungeon, I felt like the ancestors were searing into my body. I could feel the pain.
And it's a connection that Ghana has been keen to strengthen. In 2019, the government launched the Year of Return, an initiative to attract members of the African diaspora to Ghana.
I've seen enough of the American dream to know, well, it's a dream. Kicking and screaming, that's how I go back to the States, kicking and screaming.
The Return, Tuesday at 9:30 and 20 GMT. Or listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Coming up on The Real Story in the next half hour, it's the Iowa caucuses on Monday and the official kickoff of the 2024 contest to be US President. November's election is expected to be a tight one, but which issues will dominate the campaign? And will victory ultimately go to the candidate who's most successful at winning over independent voters, or the one who manages to energise their party's base and convince them to turn up en masse? That's The Real Story after a summary of the news.
BBC News with Moira Alderson. The US and Britain have mounted overnight military strikes from the air and sea against more than 60 Houthi military targets in Yemen. The operation comes in response to ongoing attacks on ships in the Red Sea by the rebel movement. The Houthis' military spokesman has said the strikes have killed 5 of their fighters and wounded 6 others. The group vowed to continue its attacks in the Red Sea. Israel has called on the International Court of Justice to reject the case brought by South Africa, alleging that it's committing genocide in Gaza. Israel's Foreign Ministry advisor said that South Africa had presented a profoundly distorted picture. Britain says it will give Ukraine more than $3 billion worth of military aid in the financial year beginning in April. The announcement coincides with a trip to Kiev by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Witnesses say airstrikes and shelling in Sudan's capital, Khartoum, killed more than 30 civilians on Thursday. An activist said some of the victims died when an artillery shell hit a house where people had gathered for a social event. Myanmar's ruling military has confirmed that it's agreed on a temporary ceasefire with armed rebel groups in the North Shan state. Under the deal, brokered by China, both sides will keep the territory they hold for now. Mass rallies are taking place in Taiwan on the eve of a pivotal general election as candidates make one final push for support. Nearly 20 million people will head to the polls on Saturday to elect a new president and members of parliament. More than 2,000 members of the South Korean entertainment industry have called for an investigation into the death of the actor Lee Sung-gyun. He was found dead in his car last month, just days after being questioned for alleged drugs abuse. That's the latest BBC News.
You're listening to The Real Story from the BBC World Service with me, Sean Lay. This week, we're looking at the 11 months of campaigning before Americans vote for their next president. On our Real Story panel, Julia Azari is a professor of political science at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Julia Manchester is a reporter for The Hill, and John Prideaux is US editor for The Economist. They've already discussed the candidates and the mechanics of this election. Now let's discuss what could fuel it, the issues. One big theme will be the health or otherwise of American democracy. Joe Biden says that Donald Trump's refusal to accept that he was defeated in the 2020 election means he's a threat to that democratic process.
Trump lost the popular vote by 7 million. Trump's claims about the 2020 election never could stand up in court. Trump lost 60 court cases. 60. Trump lost the Republican-controlled states. Trump lost before a Trump-appointed judge, and then judges. And Trump lost before the United States Supreme Court. All of it. He lost.
And Donald Trump's response? I'm not the threat to democracy. You are.
Biden's record is an unbroken streak of weakness, incompetence, corruption, and failure. Other than that, he's doing quite well, isn't he, don't you? That's a hell of a list. That's a hell of a list, right? That's why Crooked Joe is staging his pathetic fear-mongering campaign event in Pennsylvania today. Did you see him? He was stuttering through the whole thing. He's going he's a threat to democracy. They've weaponized government. He's saying, I'm a threat to democracy.
John Prideaux, how much will the idea of preserving democracy be in voters' minds, do you think?
I think it's asymmetrical, Sean. I think it matters a lot on the Democratic side. And just for the record, what Joe Biden said there was an accurate description of how the attempt to contest the election result from Donald Trump played out in American courts. He has that absolutely right. But I think this is something that Democrats, particularly college-educated Americans, care about a good deal. I think less so on the Republican side. And as you heard from those clips of Donald Trump talking, he's very adept at turning accusations that are made against him back against the accuser. So the Trump campaign has taken that language of democracy being subverted and an attempt to steal an election and turned it back on Joe Biden because of many, many court cases that Donald Trump is facing this year. So I think it matters for the Democrats. I think it might help to motivate Democratic voters. I think it's a hugely important issue for America and really for the rest of the world. But I don't see it as necessarily being the decisive one.
What are the most important court cases he faces? Maybe we should leave aside the ones that are purely kind of, if you like, personal rather than political.
Yes, there are so many of these cases that it's hard to get your head around them all. But the political ones, I mean, they're all political to some extent because having a president who's accused of committing felonies is political, right? But the ones that pertain to the operation of the presidency and the Constitution are mainly the case related to classified documents. Donald Trump walked off with lots of classified documents at the end of his presidency. There's a case related to his role in January the 6th, when various Trump supporters invaded the Capitol and attempted to try and prevent the election certification process. And there's also a court case in Georgia which relates to pressure that Donald Trump put on local Republicans there to find the votes to get him elected president in 2020.
Julie Manchester, do you think any of these will, in the end, matter?
No, I think they could ultimately matter in terms of, the primary and also the general election. With the primary, you have Donald Trump making appearances in court, facing all of these legal difficulties. And he made the decision earlier this week not to come to Iowa and campaign, and instead appear in court for the January 6th trial in Washington, D.C. Now, he wasn't in front of Iowa voters, but he was in front of a national audience. He was getting in front of that audience for free, unlike Haley and DeSantis, who are putting out resources on the ground here and running ads. In the general election, though, I think it could be more of a threat because in a general election, you have a lot more ground you want to cover nationally. And if Joe Biden is crisscrossing the country in his campaign, talking about these table issues like the economy, like abortion access, healthcare, crime, the list goes on, and Donald Trump is stuck defending himself in court and talking about his legal issues and maybe in some cases relitigating the 2020 election, that's something that independent voters don't want to necessarily hear.
Now, in just about every election held in a democratic country, one issue seems to be always salient to voters. To quote Bill Clinton's former advisor, it's the economy, stupid. Julia Azari, how is the US economy doing right now? Is it good news for Joe Biden?
This is a fascinating question because in every election year I can remember, there's a pretty straightforward answer to that. And that's just not the case this year. We've got, pretty straightforward, the kinds of indicators we would normally look at, employment, stock market, those things look fairly good. But that's not how Americans are living the economy. And there's a kind of plethora of theories about why perceptions are so negative, whether it has to do with kind of lingering after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and people just feeling bad about everything. Does it have to do with the housing market and some elements of the economy that aren't captured in some of those measures? Does it have to do with media coverage? Does it have to just straight up have to do with partisanship? We don't really know. We also don't have, I think, a clear model of how that might affect the election. Both the 2020 election and the 2022 midterm elections were a little bit different than you might have predicted based on some of these indicators. It's a little bit of a murky picture, but I want to kind of echo and emphasize something that Julia Manchester said, which is that to the extent that Trump's issues are sort of front and center, that makes the election more of a referendum on him and even a referendum on his first term in office, as opposed to making it a referendum on Joe Biden's performance. And keeping it in the Trump territory is likely to be advantageous for Biden, and likewise keeping it a referendum on Biden is likely to be advantageous for Trump. But between Trump's legal difficulties and just sort of who he is, it seems less likely that will be he'll be able to frame it that way.
John Prideaux, is that partisanship, do you think, part of the account for these attitudes to the economy? I mean, I saw some figures that suggested as soon as Joe Biden took office in 2021, the view among Democrats of the state of the economy immediately flipped. That somehow the economy that a month before they'd said was in a pretty poor way was fine again.
That's exactly right, Sean. And the same happened with Trump voters in 2016 in the run-up to that election. If you asked them how the economy was doing, they said terrible. And not even just the economy, actually. The economy is sort of a big abstract thing. It's quite hard to know how it's doing unless you follow this stuff closely. But there was some polling where the sentiment about people's personal financial situation flipped just after the presidential election in 2016 and again in 2020. And that, I think, tells you that partisanship is extraordinarily powerful in America and has the power to shape perceptions of how the economy is doing and how people are feeling about their place in the economy. And compared with pretty much any other economy in the world, America is doing really well. That doesn't seem to feed through to Joe Biden's approval rating. Maybe that will change, but maybe it won't. Maybe in American politics, partisanship now means that people's perceptions of what's going on are so skewed that the kind of underlying reality matters a lot less than it used to.
Let's take your word, John, and try to see this election wearing partisan lenses. Now, if you're a Republican supporter, one issue animating you, not least because the candidates are talking so much about it on the Republican side, is the large number of migrants crossing into the United States over its southern border from Mexico. Roughly 300,000 people are thought to have been processed last month alone. Our North America editor, Sarah Smith, sent us this report from Southern California.
Yeah, man, it's America, dude. Everybody can walk in, you can do whatever you want. Right now, it pays off to be a criminal.
This crisis on the border is a huge political problem for President Biden, threatening his chances of re-election and even putting aid to Ukraine in jeopardy, because Republicans in Congress won't vote for more money for Ukraine unless Joe Biden agrees to crack down hard on illegal immigration and basically puts an end to scenes like this.
Migrants are no longer allowed to claim asylum if they turn up at official border crossings. So thousands of asylum seekers are instead coming in illegally, undeterred by that infamous border wall. Here in Hakumba, they slip through a gap between the wall and a mountain range. This small town that's known for its hot springs has a population of just over 500 permanent residents, and they now see more than that coming across the border every day.
I think that, they should respect somebody else's property.
Maria Schuster owns the land that the migrants are camping on. She's furious that her trees are being cut down. Migrants burn them to keep warm, and that her land's now littered with trash.
So what would you tell the government to do to sort out the crisis on the border?
Close the border. Send them back. We don't have a room for them. We don't have a room for our people there in the streets. We have homeless. They should be first, better than these people. We don't know these people.
Maria Schuster there talking to the BBC's Sarah Smith. Julia Manchester, how bad is the problem actually?
From what we're seeing at the southern border, it is bad. You are hearing not only Republicans raise the alarm on the issue at the southern border, but also Democrats, particularly very vulnerable Democrats. In 2022, you had Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, who was running for re-election, warning the Biden administration to take stronger action on the situation at the southern border. You had New Hampshire Senator Maggie Hassan, who was also running for re-election at the time, warning the same thing. And this time around, you're seeing Pennsylvania Senator John Fetterman, a swing state. He's warning the Biden administration to take a much stronger stance on the border, saying that they've ignored it for too long. On top of that, you have chiefly Governor Greg Abbott of Texas busing a lot of these migrants to Democratic-run cities like Chicago and like New York City. And you're seeing Democrats in these cities, while they're very unhappy with Abbott and they'd very much rather him not be busing migrants to their cities, you're seeing these cities kind of get a taste of what it's like to be a border town, and now they're putting pressure on the Biden administration. So Biden's getting this pressure from both sides of the political spectrum, and that opens him up to criticism and I think a weakness in the general election.
It sounds, John Prideaux, as if the kind of political temperature in the United States has shifted quite dramatically, and this no longer looks quite as partisan an issue as it might have looked 4 years ago when Donald Trump was talking about build the wall.
I think that's right, Sean. I mean, it's still the case if you look at the polling that Democrats are overwhelmingly more sympathetic to migrants than Republicans are. But I'd share both Julia's perception that this is a huge problem for Democrats because it is too easy to paint Joe Biden as sort of weak and ineffectual on this issue. Actually, if you look at the numbers, the share of undocumented or illegal migrants who arrived in America when Donald Trump was president shot up in the first couple of years of his presidency. And that's because the American economy was growing strongly, as it is today, and there was lots of job creation. And so you have this paradox that the better the US economy is doing, the more incentive there is for people to try and cross into the country and illegally and improve their lives. And then what happened, of course, was COVID-19 came along and then all migration was shut down. And so if you look at Donald Trump's first term in office, illegal migration increased quite a bit and then declined a lot because of COVID-19. Joe Biden then comes in and reverses a lot of Trump's policies. You have that plus the economic recovery, and you have a very sharp increase in migration at the southern border, and it's a real problem for Democrats.
Thank you. Well, one subject which Democrats seem keen to talk about, but Republicans less so, is abortion. Julia Azari, why?
Well, in 2022, the Supreme Court reversed a 50-year-old ruling, Roe versus Wade, which protected a basic right to an abortion and set a sort of national standard of abortion rights that every state had to follow. The Supreme Court reversed this in a decision in June of 2022, and now it is sort of a free-for-all as to what states can do, which means that we've seen great polarization on that issue, with some more blue states moving in the direction of enhancing abortion rights and red states moving in the opposite direction, making much more restrictive rules.
Blue being Democrat states, red Republican states. Yeah.
Exactly, thank you. But it's also been more complicated because it turns out this issue doesn't divide as neatly along party lines as people thought, at least in the minds of voters. We've seen a number of very conservative states actually have ballot initiatives and approve of abortion rights with majorities and even super majorities, enshrining those into state laws in states like Kansas and Kentucky, which are very Republican states normally. I think the perception now is that this is quite an electoral winner for Democrats and that there is a supermajority that supports some basic level of abortion rights. And this will be the first presidential election since that decision in 2022 overturned Roe v. Wade and changed the politics of abortion in this country.
John Prideaux, do you want to comment on this?
I was at this Trump event last night where he was asked a question about abortion in Iowa. One of the things that's distinctive about Iowa's Republican electorate is there's a very high share of evangelical voters. And evangelicals historically have taken a fairly absolute line on abortion, that all abortion is murder. And he was asked about abortion laws in America, and he said, you know what, I think a 5-week abortion ban, which is what is in place in some Republican states now, I think that's too restrictive. Lots of women don't know they're pregnant at 5 weeks, and you know what, sometimes you have to compromise to win elections, and this is an area where we have to compromise. And so he absolutely understands that this is a weakness for Republicans, and he's trying to moderate on that issue already.
Julia Manchester, in 2020, Joe Biden assembled quite a broad coalition, certainly a broad coalition within his party. Somebody earlier in the program, I think, referred to him as the kind of meeting point for different factions or different strands of opinion. Is there evidence on whether or not he's kept that coalition together to sustain him this time?
There's evidence that coalition is certainly cracking. There was recent polling from USA Today a few weeks back showing Biden's support among Hispanic and Latino voters starting to fade. That's been a trend for quite some time. We know that Republicans have really worked to win over portions of that population here in the U.S. And then support among African American voters is beginning to soften as well. African American voters, particularly African American women, are the backbone of the Democratic Party's turnout apparatus, arguably. And it's not like they're leaving Biden en masse, but needs to have a stronger showing. And a lot of these voters aren't necessarily going to Trump, but they're signaling they're unhappy with Biden. Another part of that coalition is younger voters and progressive voters. And with the war in the Middle East, a lot of voters are unhappy with his handling. Earlier this week, President Biden was speaking at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. A number of young protesters were chanting ceasefire now to the president and interrupting him. I think it's emblematic of how difficult this issue will be for Biden with parts of the coalition going forward.
Let's talk about something else. Julia Azari, the Inflation Reduction Act was sort of an emblematic piece of legislation that Mr. Biden passed, which also had some significant moves in terms of climate change. What impact is that having on his support, if any?
It's hard to say in terms of the kind of broader impact on public opinion. It does maybe sort of eliminate one additional progressive hurdle. We've talked a bit about the very delicate nature of the Biden coalition. Everybody from kind of anti-Trump Republicans to very progressive activists in the electorate. That's what's necessary to cobble together that majority that Biden won in 2020. And I think this just sort of takes one progressive objection not completely off the table. There's always more that can be done, but it sort of dampens that potential objection.
We're going to move on now to talk about those questions that might determine the outcome of this election. Julia Azari, we hear that only a handful of swing states will determine the outcome. Do we know which they are, and why do they get that label?
We have a pretty good idea. The states that tend to determine elections are Wisconsin, where I'm speaking to you from, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and now added to that collection, we've also got Arizona and Georgia. And maybe taken out of that collection now are Ohio and Florida, which seem to have moved more decisively into the Republican column. How did the states get to be that way? I think the answer has to do with the rural and urban balance in these particular states, which does relate to these broader dynamics in American politics, to these more cultural dynamics. As the Democratic Party becomes a party of the cities, a party of younger people, of racial and ethnic minorities, that shapes those dynamics. So Biden, for example, won about 75% of the vote here in Milwaukee, where I am sitting in this ultimate swing state. So what balances that out is the sort of shift in more rural areas toward the Republican Party. And I think that's similar in these other swing states, is that the shifting dynamics between rural and urban and the particular population balance between rural and urban areas is what gives those states their status.
And John Prideaux, how many swing voters are there in reality? I mean, those who could vote either way or indeed not vote at all.
It's going to be quite small because, number one, most American voters are, I think, not persuadable, have made up their mind. So a recent poll from YouGov, which is the pollster The Economist works with, had 80% of voters saying they'd decided who they were going to vote for, whether it would be Biden or Trump. So that leaves some undecideds, and those are undecideds, many of them by November the 5th, will have fallen into the decided column. So you're talking about quite a small share of the overall electorate. And then, Julia's point, there are really 6 states that are likely to decide this election. And so this election is going to be, I think, very, very close, and is going to come down to a few thousand voters in those 6 swing states out of 150, 160 million Americans who will cast a ballot. And because it's going to be so close, you can say almost anything will be the decisive issue, because we're talking about really fine margins.
In a sense, it suggests that American politics is becoming much more like the year 2000, which we were told was a kind of a 1 in a million election, where it all came down to a tiny number of voters in a couple of counties in the state of Florida. Now, Florida isn't particularly in play anymore, but it is a smaller and smaller set of voters, and this seems like it's going to be a bit of a pattern. Given that, Julia Manchester, could this year's election be determined primarily by which candidate turns out the largest number of their existing supporters, In other words, which candidate energizes their base, to use the jargon?
Particularly for Biden, that's going to be very telling about what happens in this election. If Trump brings out his base, that's great. Normally it's a battle for independence, and it will be a battle for independence again and those swing voters. But for Biden, if his base is depressed, as we've seen, that's not going to be a good sign for him, because if they stay home, that automatically gives Trump more leeway. And then, of course, you have the third-party candidates or independent candidates, Cornel West, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. They could prove to be wild cards as well if they're taking away votes from either.
And Julia, just picking up on what you were saying there, how great then is the concern on both sides, in both parties, that a single gaffe by their man could swing the election against them?
There's certainly a big concern, I think, particularly when it comes to President Trump, his legal issues. He's doing a lot of appearances at the courthouse and such. I think you're already seeing the Biden campaign paint him as the chaos candidate. You've seen Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis also do that, but that's not playing as well with the Republican base. But for Biden, there's certainly room for gaffes there as well. We've seen him make gaffes in the past, but we're going to go through so many news cycles before Election Day, so really anything can end up dividing us.
I have a question for all of you as we end this edition of The Real Story. I'll ask you it in turn. What are the stakes of this election in the US and globally? Julia Azari.
And I think the stakes here are very high. It's not a normal election where it will just be a battle about the issues that Donald Trump has been very clear about wanting to use the quite powerful executive branch against his enemies. And so, whether we'll find out exactly what that means, those are the stakes of this election.
Julia, Manchester?
I think the stakes are incredibly high. I mean, you have record partisanship here in the United States, and no matter who wins this election, we're going to see that partisanship continue, but it's going to impact, the workings of Capitol Hill, of Washington, of our international organizations, such as the United Nations. I think there's a fear globally of a second Trump presidency, but at the same time, I think there's been pressure on the Biden administration surrounding the Israel-Hamas war, but also the war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia as well. So the stakes high on both.
And John Prideaux, this could be something that impacts very directly the lives of people in other countries aside from the United States.
That's 100% right, Sean. I mean, clearly the most important thing here really is for Americans, and there are some nerdy things that this election will shape that people perhaps don't talk about that much. The tax code will be rewritten in 2025 by whichever party wins this election. And as Julia said, the Trump people have said at various times they intend to use the Justice Department to prosecute Donald Trump's enemies. But this election is huge for the rest of the world. Will America continue to support Ukraine, and what will happen if it doesn't? What will happen with US-China relations? Will America continue to support Taiwan as a threat that China might invade that island? What would the US do in response? Would a Trump presidency weaken NATO, as the first one threatened to do? So this election matters a huge amount for America. It matters a lot for the West and for the rest of the world as well.
That's it for this week on The Real Story. Very many thanks to our guests. Julia Azari is a professor of political science at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Julia Magister is a reporter for The Hill, based in Washington, D.C., but currently in Des Moines, Iowa, where, along with John Prideaux, U.S. editor for The Economist, they're reporting the events leading up to Monday's caucuses, the beginning of the formal election campaign. From our producers, Paul Schuster and Max Horbury, and me, Sean Lay, that's The Real Story. Thanks for your company. Do come again.
This is the BBC World Service, investigating allegations surrounding a powerful religious figure.
TB Joshua had followers from around the globe.
I thought I was joining a church. This is what we've been praying for.
But some claim the man they knew was very different from his loving public image.
Let's tell this story.
World of Secrets, The Disciples. Wednesday at 11:30 and 23:30 GMT. Or listen now wherever you get your podcasts. In 30 minutes, Heart and Soul.
How do you prepare for death in a culture where we don't even like to use the word? Find out more with me, Esther Ogola, as I speak to a group of Kenyan Christians who are helping terminally ill patients prepare themselves for the end of life.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 11 o'clock GMT. This is Oliver Conway with the newsroom. The US and Britain hit Houthi targets in Yemen to try to stop them targeting shipping in the Red Sea.
The world cannot be held to ransom with the Houthis deliberately seeking to deny the movement of commercial shipping through a seaway that routinely moves around 20% of global trade.
But could it lead to a wider war?
The American and British enemies bear full responsibility for their criminal aggression against our Yemeni people. It will not go unpunished or unanswered.
Also today, Israel makes its case at the International Court of Justice, rejecting the accusation that it's committing genocide in Gaza. And later.
What I wasn't expecting to see was that in the same field as the giant ark, there was a